My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I blog at johnlobell.com, review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright, a survey covering his entire career, given for second-year architectural history and theory at Pratt Institute in October 2013. Now, I have 2 hours of material to present in an hour, so I'm going to talk fast with apologies. But remember, the slides are all online. And I'm going to begin by looking at, we're looking at one architect. So how do you look at one architect? And my first point is going to be, there's a lot of different ways to do it. So how do we approach the work of an architect? And I'm going to not go through these right here because we're going to have a slide for each one. Biography, who influenced them, etc. Now, the one that I don't have here is what's happening to Chicago around them. And there's a page I have in some of my lectures from Louis Sullivan's The Autobiography of an Idea, and he gives the statistic for the population growth. Imagine in the years that you spend at Pratt, the population of Brooklyn doubles. That's the kind of explosive growth that Meredith was talking about. So we have to keep that in mind, and then some other issues. So start with biography. And I'm going to look at some other art forms. You cannot speak about Beethoven's work without talking about his life and how, facing the condition of deafness, he reinvents himself as a romantic hero and destroys the Viennese Symphony with his own Third Symphony, and then most famously the Fifth and through to the Ninth, totally tied into what's happening in his life. So in Frank Lloyd Wright's life, he lived mainly in three places. His first house, where with his first wife and 6 children, Taliesin East, and when there's like 6 feet of snow there in the winter, so he figures out he can spend the winters in Arizona. Frank Lloyd Wright wrote his own autobiography, and if you're interested in a biography of Wright, I would start by recommending Ada Louise Huxtable's, very brief, but the point is for each period, like, okay, Frank Lloyd Wright's youth on a farm, you say, now read this biography for that. So it's sort of a guide to other biographies. Who influenced them and who did they influence? Or whom did they influence? So if we look at a Picasso portrait of Vallard Cubist painting, the way this grows out of Cézanne, who's a reaction to the Impressionists. Cézanne saying, I want to bring back solidity. The Impressionists are a reaction to, I'll use a value word here, the decadence of French academic painting, which is a sort of decline of French neoclassicism, which is a reaction against the frivolity of the Rococo. So we can see any work, there's a quote from Harold Bloom speaking about poetry, but we can apply it to any art. Bloom says, well, I'll say it in architecture, there are no works of architecture, there are only relationships among works. So each work only makes sense in relationship to others. And then there's the specific continuity in Wright's life. So Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan worked for Frank Furness. One of his most famous buildings is the Fisher Fine Arts Building or Furness Building on the Penn campus. Frank Lloyd Wright worked for Louis Sullivan. He was project architect on the Wainwright Building, but he's actually more influenced by Sullivan's organic philosophy. Then we get to Wright, and then in one period of his career, Nice is influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of open plan. Just for the one building. And Brick Country House. I'm very influenced by Vincent Scully, which we'll get to. So, Here is Wright's Ward Willett House. And speaking of influence, so Scully makes the following point. He takes the Ward Willett House, looks at the back, and then he dates when the Washtenaw Folio is published. So Wright goes to Europe to do a publication of his work. This then influences the Steel artists. We find in Brick Country House by Mies this kind of open plan coming from Wright. We see this in Mondrian, and we see this kind of asymmetrical plan in the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus sort of had a German expressionist aesthetic until the Steel artists came there to give a lecture, introducing them to their much more geometric work. So we can see an individual architect in the arc of who influenced them and whom they influenced. We can look at their style. We talk about Picasso, we talk about the blue period, the rose period, the pre-Cubist period, the Cubist period. So we can look at what distinguishes someone's style and its development. In the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, we want to focus very much on the Prairie style, distinguished by it's asymmetrical, an open plan, we'll go over this several times, one room flowing into another, interpenetrating of inside and outside, whole walls open up as windows, a sort of pinwheeling effect pinned down by a massive chimney core, low sloped overhanging roofs, and horizontality. So if we look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie style, we'll look at these characteristics. The community within which they work. So there's a famous period in architecture in New York about 40 years ago. A group of then young architects, Eisenman, Graves, Gwathmey, Haydak, and Meyer, were not getting very much attention. They weren't getting published, and they said, we'll just publish our own book. And so these architects, although later became very different one from another and disavowing one another, there was a period when they were very supportive of each other. They would do conferences together, lecture together, and sort of defend themselves against the outside world. What community was Wright in? Well, we can relate him to the Prairie style, and there were other architects using this style. So this is a house by Walter Burley Griffin. And then there are some architects that are kind of remotely connected to Wright and sort of inspired by him. So Paolo Solari, who just died, Arco Sante, was a friend of Wright's. A very close friend was Bruce Goff, and this is, he was sort of inspired by Wright that he could be quite free and unconventional. And then Green and Green, working in California, sort of in the craftsman style, parallel to Wright's Prairie style house. We can do a formal analysis of individual work. So when you're looking at a textbook, it'll often refer to the triangular composition in a Leonardo da Vinci painting. And so we can do a formal analysis of a Frank Lloyd Wright building. So we can talk, and this will repeat some of what I said about the Prairie style, but this is the Roby House, characterized by rectilinear interpenetrating planes. We might even use the term the planes slide past each other, even though they're not moving. The low-sloped overhanging roof, the massive chimney core, the open plan, one space flowing into another. So this would be a formal analysis of an individual work. We can look at the influence of building technology on an architect. So here is the Crystal Palace, made possible by new technologies of being able to mass produce cast iron in a series of identical pieces. And one of our readings for today is The Art and Craft of the Machine. Very important essay by Frank Lloyd Wright, 1901. You have to read it carefully because the writing's a little florid by our standards, but he's sort of saying the following. He's starting with William Morris. And William Morris was an English social critic who, along with his movement, the art and crafts movement, said industrial production is ugly, the products are ugly, the process is ugly, and through the smoke coming out of their factories, this spoils the landscape. And so William Morris, among many other things, launched an arts and crafts movement. Here, a cartoon of him at his loom weaving. This is wallpaper he designed. He wrote and then designed and published books. But so the arts and crafts handcrafted movement is put up against the ugliness of the machine. But Wright rightly realizes if you put art against the machine meaning the whole industrial process, whole industrial economy, which is going to win. And in a radical creative move, Wright says the machine is the art form of the 20th century. And by that he doesn't mean machines are beautiful, but he means is that the Greeks used here in a bronze casting the cutting edge technology of their time, carving stone, casting bronze. We today should be using the cutting edge technologies of our time, not of their time. And he says the machine is, in fact, the metamorphosis of ancient art and craft. So that's his relationship to the technology of the day. And here he is using concrete. And in Unity Temple, we'll see all these buildings. This is not only poured in place concrete, it's slip formed. So that this piece of formwork here was previously here, and then previously here. And as they poured, they slid it up. And very crude slip forming, but here he is using a cutting edge material of his day in a unique way. And then he says, I don't know how many people realize it, but this entire building is one piece. And so a totally new way of thinking about architecture, same with the Guggenheim. We can look at the position of an architect in the larger culture. So when we looked at a Baroque architecture, Borromini, San Carlo, we looked at the context of Baroque painting, Baroque sculpture, Bach's music, and even Newton's physics. And so in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, we can look at the crisp abstract rectilinearity of his buildings in relationship to abstract modern art, in relationship to Einstein's special relativity, and to even Stockhausen's music. Grand themes. So when we look at the Villa Rotunda, we talk about humanism, that this places the human being in the center, and it's a secular building challenged to the religious themes of the day, and is humanist. And in Frank Lloyd Wright, the book by Vincent Scully came out the year after Wright died, and he begins by quoting Wright, every great architect is a great interpreter of his time, his day, his age. So in a heroic view of the architect, not that much in favor today, but seeing the architect as grappling with the large issues of the day. And so Scully says, Wright's early period, he was an heir to a period that was in part Jeffersonian, previously found its best expression in works of Melville, Whitman, and Twain. And then in his later period, he's in the later 20th century, he says, and it did more than a little to bring the second of them, that of the mid-20th century, into being. So this is seeing the architect as a heroic figure in struggle with his era. So now as I go through Wright, you can think about which of these we're making reference to. the person. And I'm not going to go through all this, but you can download the slide. But he was born in a farming town. His father left the family when he was 14. They were poor, and he spent a lot of time at his uncle's working and he was a little guy. He was about 5'4", 5'6". So he was a little, as a child as well, working very hard on the farm and loving every moment of it. And so hard work, the farm, the countryside was always in him. His father was a preacher, introduced him to the Transcendentalists, and he was a pianist to the music of figures like Bach, but was weak and eventually left. His mother, and there are just these mythologies about Wright. So his mother decorated her nursery with engravings of English cathedrals so he could be influenced to become an architect even while he was still in the womb. She got started early. And then she bought him Froebel blocks so that he would start to be able to think spatially. She intended him to be an architect. He didn't finish high school, spent a year in engineering school, dropped out, and eventually worked for Louis Sullivan, who became his mentor. So his education was primarily in Sullivan's office. Got married, had 6 kids, did a lot of traveling to Japan, became a dealer in Japanese prints to help, because you don't make that much money as an architect. Left his wife for Ma Chaney. She was murdered at Taliesin in a very tragic event along with her children, and then later married Ogavana, stayed married for the rest of his life, and they divided their time between Taliesin, east and west. 1,100 plus designs, 500 plus completed works all over the country, concentrated around the Midwest where he lived, quite a few in California. So here is his house that he built for his family. It's in the shingle style. If you look in Scully, there's very good comparisons to the shingle style works that this is a direct takeoff from, and more mythology and anecdotes, but Wright would never admit any influences. He was a total original. So when he came to lecture at Yale, and Vincent Scully, who's the great historian at Yale, and he's now emeritus, Scully said to him, what about the influence of the shingle style in your early houses? And Wright responds, son, architecture began when I started putting those houses out on the prairie. So you can't rely on an architect to be an honest presenter of, they're gonna edit how they present their work. And then this house kept expanding as his family expanded, and his office eventually was built over here. Then another residence in Wisconsin on family land, and eventually he didn't like to call it a school. He had an apprenticeship, so he had a group of students with him working on his projects, and then for the winters they would be in Arizona, in an area that was in the middle of nowhere and is now being encroached on. And there's an architectural school there now. So, backgrounds. His mother gives him these Froebel blocks as a child, and very important, like language is acquired when you're very young. If you're, 4 years old and you come to another country, you pick up the language in a matter of weeks. But if you're 15 years old in French class in high school, you go nuts. You can't learn it anymore at that point. Same thing with learning spatiality, and Wright learned it early. He then worked with Louis Sullivan. Now, this is important. This is the Wainwright building. Wright worked on the building, and we see it was U-shaped with a courtyard because they didn't have air conditioning, they had limited lights, they didn't have the big fluorescents we have today. Now, this is the way it is today. This has been filled in as a courtyard, but this should be red, and there should be no skylight here. So here's the building facing the street, the facade, and It's got Sullivan's 5 points for a skyscraper and all that kind of stuff. 3 if you simplify it, base shaft, corners. And then back here, there's none of that, because you don't see the back. And Wright really objected to that. Wright said, you don't apply the aesthetic like a suit of clothes. It should organically grow from the inside out, and therefore not be the same, but be similar all the way around, because my front's different from my back, but it's in the same family. Because the organs and the ribs and the lungs and everything are inside for both the front and the back. And so this is going to be inherent in Wright's attitude of an architectural aesthetic. It's not something that's applied, it's something that comes from the structure, the spaces, and the materials. And so the term he uses for this is organic architecture, and there's several meanings to the term. One is the use of natural materials related to natural features of the site, but then what does that mean? All materials are natural. But he meant a lot of other things by that. He meant embodying the democratic American spirit, and by democratic he meant identifying within each individual their potential and allowing it to flourish. But most importantly, he meant an architecture of essences, that we say steel is good in tension. Steel wants to be long and attenuated. Concrete is good in compression. It wants to be squat and massive. It wants to be that there is a desire within the material. And so it has an essence, and you want to help that, as a midwife, help that essence express itself. So that's what he meant by organic architecture. He says, what is honor? Not the rules of code, but the nature of honor. What would be the honor of a brick? That in the brick which makes the brick a brick. And you're going to find really strong parallels to Heidegger there. But there's something in the brick that is gathering to itself brickness. There's a lot of approaches to thought that says this is gibberish, but this is the tradition that Wright is working on. Okay, now we'll zip through Wright's career, and very abbreviated. So there's early work. There's even work by Frank Lloyd Wright before he becomes Frank Lloyd Wright, we might say. And if you're a serious Wright scholar, you'll say, I see hints of Frank Lloyd Wright in there. But it's like the client wanted a Victorian house. There's bills to be paid. He does a Victorian house. But here, 1893, it's his first house on his own after he gets fired from Sullivan's office. And what he was doing was, it's called the bootleg houses. While he was working for Sullivan, he was designing houses on the side because he was terrible with money. And he always had the fastest horses and then later the fastest cars, and ran around town, very expensive clothes. Later in his career, he would call up the Packard dealer and have him send over a Packard. And after a couple of weeks, the dealer said, are you going to send it back or do you want to pay for it? He says, you expect me to pay for it? I'm Frank Lloyd Wright. You're supposed to be honored to give it to me as a gift. At one point, he incorporated himself. He was always struggling for money because he just spent too much. So when Sullivan discovered he was doing these houses, you're not supposed to do that. You get work, you bring it into the office. You don't do it on your own. So he fired him. They didn't speak for many years. But this is the first house he then did after that, the Winslow house. It's quite neoclassical, very symmetrical, but we see hints here of what's to come. So the slope of the roof is getting low. It overhangs. And then under the eave, the second, it's a two-story house, second floor is dark, it's in shadow, so we sort of see it as a one-story house. So he's emphasizing horizontality. Very brief on each of these periods, because we're going to go back and look at some more of it. So then there's the Prairie style. So he does a series of houses. The first one that's considered a fully mature expression of his Prairie style is the Ward Willett House, 1900-1902. In Highland Park. These are all in suburbs around Chicago. So Wright lived in Oak Park, and when you go there, which at some point you will, because this is just one of the meccas that we architects visit, you go to the Frank Lloyd Wright house that we saw earlier, and from there, if you time it right, so when the houses are open, you'll get a tour of the houses in the neighborhood, and either, if it's not the right time, you'll see them on the outside. And if it is the right time, some of them are open for tours. And if you had a very good arm, with a rock, you could hit about 6 of them from the Frank Lloyd Wright house. So he's really doing a lot of houses in Oak Park, other Chicago suburbs as well. So again, we have this open plan with spaces flowing from one to another, inside to outside, an asymmetry, a massive chimney core, which we don't see expressed here, we will on Roby, holding it all down, and an emphasis on horizontality. Again, 2 stories, but second story disappears in this the dark material up here, and we emphasize, it looks like a 1-story house that emphasizes horizontality. Most famous Prairie style house is the Roby house, same features we just saw, and the massive chimney core is more prominent here. We'll see more about that chimney core as we go. Interior, here's the chimney. It's tied in with the stairs, so we say core, and then the space flows around it. We're in the living room, flow around it to the dining room on the other side, even flow through the space above the fireplace. A lot of pioneering stuff. We're not too far into electricity at this point already. We've got lights hidden above the grill here, these grills acting as air vents, these acting as points of attention, double glazing, heat coming up from here to counter the downdraft, and a little bit busy by our taste today. He uses this, it's called art glass. Some of it's stained, but if you have glass that's like stained glass, but it's all clear, it's called art glass. But these are French doors or French windows that open floor to ceiling for this openness to the outside. Another one of these houses that, the only reason I have it in here, well, there's 2 reasons. One of them, this is the Martin House in Buffalo, just around that time, and it was a mess. It had been chopped up, other houses have been put in the middle of it. There's a little apartment building here. It's been totally restored, and it was just finished a few months ago. It's absolutely magnificent. If you get to Buffalo for any reason, you absolutely have to go see it. It's tremendously magnificent. Looking very modern, crisp, rectilinear, doing away with applied ornament, slowly leaves Wright. Interior, he was really liked the Swing Victory, Samothrace, so he has lots of reproductions of it in his work. What we're looking at is kind of a walkway here with plants taking you to the garage area back here. Same time, 1905 here, he does Unity Temple. Now, he's in principle, something's going on here that relates to a building called the Larkin Building, but I'm going to skip that for the moment. This is a Unitarian church that Wright's a member of, and they're building a new building, and they were not happy with what they got. They got a concrete box. Where are the Gothic arches? So this is very pioneering modern architecture, and it has interesting organization. Main space, secondary space, entrance in between. And we're going to see this develop a bit. So here we are inside. The minister is here. Double balconies going around. Balcony here. Down there is down to the basement where you hang your coat when you come in. These balconies go around. And so that the community is looking at each other as well as at the minister, because Unitarians are very communitarian. And then these massive piles of columns are hollow, so the air can come through it, the ventilating air, and they hold up a waffle slab with glass in them, a sort of a peak skylight above to keep the rain off of this. And then in here, I'm not showing one, but it's already looking like a Mondrian painting 20 years before Mondrian. Here it is under construction again with this slip forming. And it made it very economical for the budget that the client had. Okay, 1920s. And going back, Wright's career comes crashing to an end when he leaves his wife. That's a scandal. I mean, today it would just, get you more work, but being in the tabloids. But at the time, it was a scandal. He didn't do that. He runs off to Europe with Ma Chaney, and then they come back, and then there's this tragedy where she's murdered, so very devastating for him. But eventually, he goes, spends some time in California, and he does. Now, you can say concrete block or concrete tile, but we should really say concrete tile. He does a series of houses. The first one is the Millard House, and that's the only one I'm going to show you again because this is very surveying. But what he does here, he pours slab on grade. He then scratches a grid on it for what he's going to do. He then has these tiles. They're about 18-inch square, 3 inches thick, and there's a half-round notch on the edge going all the way around. When you put two together, that half-round notches, they butt each other, and you have a round. In that round are quarter-inch rebars in both directions and filled with ground. So this becomes a very strong slab. You can use it for ceiling, flat ceilings. And then you do two of these because you have a double wall in masonry in order to handle the moisture and insulation. This is very crude in terms of moisture and insulation by our standards today when we have very elaborate flashing and there might be insulation in there and stuff like that. But in principle, it's well worked out. Now, these were poured in wooden forms on the ground right there. And so they're very low quality, and some of these houses are in trouble because concrete will deteriorate. But he thought of them as an experiment, prototyping, for what would then be done in a factory as precast. Once you do precast in a factory, it's very high quality, it'll last, it'll stand up to the weather, et cetera, et cetera. Although we don't have any freezing in California, so this was in New York, they'd be gone, but they survived better in California. Spectacular interiors and a handling of three-dimensional space. Now, when you visit these houses, you're going to be struck by, if you use a wide enough angle lens, you can get things to look very spacious. But his buildings are very tight. Small spaces, very tight. Sometimes it's a matter of budget, but he liked the low ceiling. Some people said because he was short, but because it would push you forward horizontally. Think about when you go into the Guggenheim Museum. Very low ceiling coming in, and then it explodes up into the rotunda. And so that's deliberate, that you get more of an effect from the rotunda having been in a low space on the way there. Okay, Wright spent about a decade with no work. I mean, literally nothing. And he held up at Taliesin, and he is still only Taliesin East at this point. And he got some income from the students. Imagine going to your parents. There's a New York kid, Edgar Taffel, in the 1930s, says to his parents, I want to study architecture. I want to go study this guy, Frank Lloyd Wright. And his parents say, no way, the guy's a nut. You're not going to have a degree. You'll never get a job. He did. He ended up being job captain on Falling Water and Johnson Wax. So it was pretty good for launching a career. But they also had to pay tuition, so that sort of, which wasn't very much in those days, but that sort of helped him keep going. They worked on big projects for Broadacre City, his city of the future, which was basically suburban. And then in the 1930s, something happened. He got two commissions, whammo. One of the students working for him was Edgar Kaufman Jr. Father, the family, owned the department store in Pittsburgh, so they were pretty well to do. And they had land outside of Pittsburgh in a place called Bear Run, where there's a big rock and a waterfall, and they would picnic on the rock and look at the waterfall, and it's time to build a weekend house. And Edgar Kaufman Jr. says, hey, Dad, why don't we get Wright to do it? Okay, well, the thing goes hugely over budget, and it ends up on the cover of Time magazine as the most famous house of all time. So that wasn't a bad investment for the Kaufmans, sort of getting publicity for himself and his department store. So this is Falling Water, and sort of anchored into the hill as it goes up, cantilevering out. We'll look at plans in a minute. Inside, we continue this open plan space, this kind of spaciousness, and this interpenetration of inside and outside. So floor-to-ceiling glass. He's got mullions. His favorite color has now become this sort of rust red. But the floor surface is exactly the same on inside and outside, emphasizing this flow. And here in the corner, the glass comes together here, and there's no mullion, but glass. Just two pieces of glass touching. Now today, we put a little bead of clear silicone there. They didn't have that. But this was, it's the corner that will keep you in the box. And Wright wanted to destroy the box, one of his favorite phrases, and doing away with the corner helps do that. And this flow from inside to outside, you see right here. Now, a couple of things. One is, this is a fieldstone, locally quarried fieldstone, which he, is organics using the material of the site. But here's the glass wall. Well, first thing, fieldstone. Okay, I understand the fieldstone on the outside, but now we got it on the inside. You brush against that with, nice clothes, it's going to ruin it. Why would you use this rough stone on the inside of a residence? And the point is, it's more important for him to have this continuity of inside and outside, the flow from one to another, which he also achieves by the glass coming in and no mullion here. The glass goes right into a slit in the stone so that your eye is not interrupted in this flow. Now that's dangerous. I mean, it's not going to cause a catastrophe. It's just, there's a good chance the glass will crack because you want the glass to come into steel and you want neoprene in the steel there to sort of cushion it. But he's not going to do that. It has to come right into the stone so that he can get this flow of continuity. The other project he gets is Johnson Wax headquarters. And read this out. This is 1950. This gets added. So we're just looking at this. Spectacular brickwork, and Wright did not like columns. We're going to look at that again in a sec. When he did use a column, it was sort of like an anti-column. So here are the columns, mushroom columns, and they come out, spread out, and then in between them, he's got skylights. This is all done with Pyrex tubing that is jammed together with neoprene cushioning in between them, all leaked like hell, but it was experimental. And then there's no windows looking out, band of glass running around. He describes it as like, this is the main workspace. And of course, Johnson Wax is now a huge company. This is just a little piece of their headquarters. But it makes this serene, very pleasant work environment. He did the furniture, which is a whole story in itself. And then finally, 1950s, which I'll refer to as a summing up. One of the projects he got in 1952 was the Price Tower in Bartlettsville, Oklahoma. Now, Bruce Goff sort of became the family architect of the Price family. They're an oil pipeline family, oil pipeline business in Oklahoma. And they came to Goff and they said, we need a headquarters. And Goff said, Wright never got a chance to build his tower. Why don't we give it to him? Very generous for an architect to give up a commission like that. And this is a project Wright did in 1929 for 3 apartment buildings, all linked together on 2nd Avenue and 9th Street at the St. Mark's Church. So it's called St. Mark's Towers, and it didn't happen because the stock market crashed. So here you got a chance to do basically similar idea later, and it integrates office space and apartments throughout the building in a very complex way. He's got these fins that open up to elevators, and then these floors, the geometry of these floors alternate. So it'll go like that, and then like that. Really complicated. And then each face is different because it's encountering the morning sun or the nude sun or north sun or south sun, etc. The building was always rather tight. The apartments are tight, the office space, you want big expansive office space these days. So that was tight. And so by the 1970s, it was abandoned, and it was kept in okay shape, but it wasn't being used. And finally, someone figured out what you do with a building like that. What they do with the Reliance building in Chicago. Boutique Hotel, PSFS building in Philadelphia. Boutique Hotel. This is now a boutique hotel. So I can't wait to stay in it. And then famously, we dated 1959, but it started already in the 40s, the Guggenheim Museum. Now, this edition is by Gwathmey Siegel, but it's exactly what Frank Lloyd Wright shows in some of his drawings, to have an anonymous slab backing the building so that it'll have a backdrop for the building and not be looking at the backs and sides of these other buildings. We face on to Central Park, and we come in and we have our spiral museum, and this was originally offices, now an expansion of the museum. Here's the space. Interestingly, he never knew how he was going to build it, and a builder finally came to him. He says, I hear you're trying to get this building built, I'm going to build it for you. And this guy was a very capable engineer as well as contractor, and what they worked out is these fins are the structure. We then span from here to here, and then we cantilever out to here. So when you go there, look at it and see if you can read how the structure is working. We'll talk more, we'll look at a plan of this in a minute. A series of themes. Let's look at this Prairie School once more and start with Palladio's Villa Rotunda. So in this humanist statement, Palladio puts the human being in the center. If we take Protagoras' comment, man is the measure of all things, Greek comment, borrowed by the Renaissance as its slogan, to measure, you need a reference point to measure from. So this puts us at the center of the XY Cartesian coordinates and Z, if you count the dome. And starting with that, Wright then drops the chimney core in the center, so we can't be in the center. So it's an anti-humanist position where we are, in a Copernican revolution, thrust out of the center to meander around it, even in and out, as part of nature. So it's integrating us with nature rather than differentiating us in the center. This open plan is also reflective of social issues. So in the Victorian family, after dinner, the father goes to the smoking room, the mother goes to the sewing room, the children go to the nursery. Everybody has an identity and a role prescribed for them, and there's a box for each of those roles. In the modern family, everybody just sort of hangs out. So these identities break down. It's a kind of free floating. And the father's just a kid along with the other kids. So the open plan is indicative of that free-floating quality to the family and the lack of prescribed identities, which in existentialism demands of us that our identity is not given, but we each make ourselves and remake ourselves at every moment. So in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, there's the father, or general, confronts the prince, the young man who's the idiot, and the prince says to him, "Who are you?" And the father says, "What do you mean?" "Well, who are you?" He says, "Well, I'm a father, a general, a Russian, and a Christian." And the idiot says, "Yes, but who are you?" And the guy just gets very confused. Because this is a totally new idea, that you are not your roles. You are something that you make of yourself in a continuing act of making and remaking. Wright is embodying that idea, and this space, as you move this way, is totally different from this one as you move this way. It's your activity in the building that creates it. It's not there and given before you get there. Around this time, 1869, Catherine Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister, designed something called the American Woman's Home. And she has a vision of the home as a machine for living, that women should, in the domesticity of the home, apply the same industrial efficiency to their work that men are applying in the factory. And so the house is a machine. So she's got a central core with the kitchen, the bathrooms, in the basement, the furnace on each floor, the Franklin stoves, all linked into this mechanical core around which are flexible open spaces. But she did not have an aesthetic. She had a gingerbread aesthetic for this. So this is exactly the organization of Wright's open plan, responding to this modern home as a place for economical consumption, and the term is home economics. If you go back, the small farm did both production and consumption. You made a chair in the workshop and then you sat on it. You grew food, prepared it, and you ate it. In the emerging home here, you work in the office or the factory, and you come home and you only do consumption in the home. So the house is a machine for consumption. This is the idea Catherine Beecher puts forward, and it's another thread of understanding Wright. Now I want to look, I haven't shown you a lot of plans, so now we're going to look at some plans. We're going to look at 3 patterns. I'm going to introduce an idea that an artist will very often begin their career by laying down a basic concept that's going to unfold over their career. Here we have Mondrian's mature work. Here we have some early paintings by Mondrian. If we work backwards from here to here to here to here, we see already in here are the hints of his mature work. In Elvis Presley's work, his first work is at Sun Records, and the album you would get to get all those recordings are called the Sun recordings. And then we get, he launches, his contract goes to RCA, he launches with blue suede shoes and becomes this Dionysian figure threatening to bring down the culture. Then come white leather jumpsuits, Las Vegas, and drugs. And toward the end, he then does From Elvis in Memphis, which recalls everything he did here. So he had laid down here his entire career. If we look at Portrait of the Artist, a Young Man by James Joyce, he describes what he's going to do. In Ulysses, he takes the novel form to its highest state, and then in Finnegan's Wake ends it. And he laid out the whole program here for what he would do in his 3 novels. So let's see how Wright did this. There are 3 organizing patterns in Wright's work. First is the open plan. I can't say anything about that because I've been talking about it continually. But here it is in very early in his career, the first mature expression of his Prairie style. Again, in an open plan, there's no return here. It's the return, the corner, that makes a box. And by not returning here, it's not just the size of the opening, but the no return. The one space flows into the other, and then also flows to the outside. Here we are again, the concept, again, no return. We do away with the boxy rooms, one space flows to another. Here it is in the Roby house, and if we come up the stairs, if you move through the space this way, as opposed to this way, they're 2 totally different experiences as you move through here. Now there's one other thing here. These are the drawings from the Wasmuth Folio, so I should point out one thing. If you start by saying, we're not going to have any applied ornament, okay, we're going to do away with sticking classical columns on our buildings. Okay, that's negative. That's what you're not going to do. What are you going to do? You can very easily have a very plain box. So Wright says, well, I'm going to have this rich geometric play of rectilinear planes interpenetrating each other. Okay, that sounds arbitrary. You're just going to throw them around? No. And he makes his drawings this way so that we can see how the forms in the elevation derive from the plan. Now, it's a little bit of an issue here because the plan is in plan and this is in perspective, so they don't exactly line up. Later, he puts his plans in perspective as well, and then they exactly line up. So he's showing that these forms that we saw, these abstract geometric forms that we saw on Unity Temple looking very rectilinear, are not arbitrary, but grow out of the spaces, the materials, the functions, and the mechanical. Here we are, 1935-6 at Falling Water, and we've got our open plan, totally flowing from inside to outside, floor to ceiling glass. And a really interesting little device. There's an attempt by some historians to say that Falling Water was influenced by the European moderns. So Wright's early work influenced the Europeans, and then we get the Lobell House by Neutra, and then Wright's influenced by that. And Wright responds, oh yeah? Well, how come I was already doing it in 1909 when Neutra was still in kindergarten? And I challenge you to find any difference between these two buildings, other than he's got some dark trim on here. But, you know, here's the core, projecting this way, projecting this way, 1, 2, and 2 balconies and a roof, 2 balconies and a roof. It's the exact same house. You already did it in 1909. So these are these themes. Okay, the dual space is our next theme. So here we are, Unity Temple. Major space, minor space. Entrance in between. Balcony running around the outside. Skylight above. And then hollow columns carrying the air. Here's the Larkin building, an office building in Buffalo by Wright. Actually came before Unity Temple. Major space, minor space. Entrance in between. Balconies running around, open courtyard in the center, skylight above, and then these tubes carrying the mechanical. Here's the Martin House. Now, this took me a long time. Suddenly one day, oh my God. Here's the plan. And it's just an utter jumble. How can you make anything out of this plan? We start to look at it. Well, here's the entrance. Okay. Looks like there's a space here and a space here. And then here he's got these things are filled with the radiator pipes and the venting. So he's got one here, one here, one here. Oh my God. Major space, minor space, entrance in between. The hollow supporting columns running up through it. So this pattern just runs through the work. Here we are, Johnson Wax. Again, don't look at this. We'll see that in a minute. So, major space, minor space, entrance in between. Balcony running all the way around it, skylight above, hollow tubes running through it. Exact same thing. How many people have not been in the Guggenheim? Okay, so you two guys got an assignment for the weekend. So, major space, minor space, entrance in between, balcony running around, skylight above, hollow tubes running through it, carrying HVAC mechanical. It's the same plan as Unity Temple. It just curves it. One last theme, the tree-like tower. So, we start with Mises' Seagram building. We'll see in a few weeks. I guess we'll see it next semester. And this is, but you can understand this building because it's exactly the same as any steel-framed Chicago school building with a rectilinear steel column grid. And Wright hated that. And so there's a lecture, during the lecture, he makes a series of hand gestures. And he says, this is weak and I hated Greek art. For several reasons. One is it's humanist. He's an anti-humanist, he's an organicist. But Okay, so he refers to this as just inherently unstable. This is inherently very stable. So he prefers the folded plate to he called it cut and butt, or we would say post and lintel. So here is very early on in his career, he's laying down this idea, 1896, a windmill on the family property in Spring Green. It's right next to Taliesin, which hadn't been built at this time. And Romeo and Juliet for the erotic analogy of these interpenetrating spaces. So he has this octagonal folded plate form penetrated by a diamond folded plate form, giving you a very strong structure. This is sort of rooted into the ground as a taproot, and we'll see that again in a minute. Here we see it. So here, 1950, he does this addition to Johnson Wax, which includes this research laboratory tower. And there's a long story here. Every other floor is bigger, every other floor is smaller. So these are sort of balconies with the glass running on the outside surface. The glass is these Pyrex tubes. Won't go into all that. But instead of, there are no columns. So there's this taproot, then this hollow center coming up like the trunk of a tree, and then spreading out like plates strung along the center, or like branches, but branches are linear, and these are coming out in all directions. It's interesting to compare Wright to another architect we'll see next year, Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn's interested in articulation. This is the structure, this is the HVAC. He put them right next to each other. He could have, made them one thing and saved his client a lot of money. But he wants to say, this is structure, this is HVAC. Wright wants to do the exact opposite. He wants to integrate. He says the trunk of the tree is the structure, but it's also where all the sap's going up and down. It's the whole system. So his central structural core is full of the elevators, the ducts, the stairs, and everything all in this core. And so that it is both the central core and, well, this core is both structural and mechanical. And finally, one of his last buildings, it's called Mile High Building, or the Illinois, 1956. It's a project. Here's the Empire State Building. Here's the pyramids, here's the Washington Monument, here's Wright's Mile High Building. We're getting there. The building in Dubai is a half a mile, and it is on the drawing boards is a 3/4 mile, so we'll get there soon. This is just totally a project, but Wright didn't have a client or anything. But we see these sort of fins supporting the building, and then this taproot. So again, it's like a tree. It doesn't have columns out here. It's all cantilevered out from this central core. This is the theme which he's doing in, pardon me, for 1896, and here we are, 1956. 60 years later, we've got this theme still played out. Now, one more thing, a grand theme. So the idea of this engaging large issues. I like to say that all of philosophy can be boiled down to one sentence, which is a two-part question. Who are we and what are we doing here? And in one way of looking at things, we can say there's humans, natures, and spirit, or God, man, and nature. The humanist position says the human being is the highest and central of those three. And the organic position says human being, nature, and spirit are one integrated whole. There's a sense in which human beings are natural animals, and spirit is in all things. So it's all one integrated thing. So here are two, in simplified terms, different philosophical positions about who we are and what we're doing here. So the humanist position comes to us in modern times. Greeks have a position very similar. In the Renaissance, and is well exemplified in the Villa Rotunda, with its marking the spot of the human being. And here is another villa, Katsura Imperial Villa in Japan. Very asymmetrical, very integrated with its landscape, sort of functional in its layout, spaces flowing one into another, interpenetration of inside and outside. Sounds a bit like Frank Lloyd Wright. We keep discovering more trips he made to Japan. It's now been pushed back to 1905 as his first trip there. 1893, he saw a Japanese pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair. So there's a very strong influence of not only Japanese architecture, but this whole organic philosophy that we see in Japan. So let's go back to Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture. Louis Sullivan did 3 books. The last one is A System of Ornament, and you can find reprints of it. On the back page, he has this drawing. This is a seed, imagine, say, a peanut, and you pull it open, and this is the germ. So these are the cotyledons, and while it's sprouting, the food comes from here until the photosynthesis gets going. So he says the germ, this part, is the real thing, the seed of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function, which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. Now, this is Louis Sullivan, but I would put these words in Frank Lloyd Wright's mouth. This is where they overlap, they're similar, not in their architecture. Dig this slide up later and read it carefully. So, for example, Sullivan says, when he talks about function, he says, I do not mean the crude function of the materialist. Function, oh, well, we have 300 students, if there's a fire drill, go down the corridor, how wide does it have to be? He says, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about that kind of function. The function is the will to power. That's what the function is. And it finds its expression in form. So, the acorn wants to be an oak tree. The wanting to be is the will to power, or the function. The oak tree is the form. And Sullivan says, the office wants to be a proud and soaring thing. Now, we get lots of tricky stuff here. How can an inanimate thing want something? And it doesn't even exist yet. Louis Kahn uses the same phrase. He begins every project asking, what does this building want to be? So this gives you something to think about. What do these people mean by form and function? And it's much richer than, oh, how wide does a corridor have to be? So, the idea of human beings dominating the landscape, being the central thing, being integrated with the landscape. And now, I would put Corbu in the humanist camp. The column, the Greek humanist column, is a metaphor for the human being, and the building is on piloti, the columns. So I would put him in this tradition. And I would put Frank Lloyd Wright in this tradition. So here are 2 leading modern architects, 2 leading 20th century architects, taking polar opposite positions about who we are and what we're doing here. A humanist position versus an organicist position. So with that, I leave you, if you buy this approach, to think about, well, what's this guy saying? What's our architecture today? What is its position about who we are and what we're doing here? Last slide. Think about the technological changes you're going to experience during your life, and maybe it's going to be quite a bit. Here's what Frank Lloyd Wright experienced. This is his first house on his own, the Windsor House. See this arch here? This takes you through to the stables in the back. This is a little cast iron Scotty dog you use to scrape the manure, the horse manure and the mud off your boots before you go inside. This building was designed to have atomic powered elevators. In 1959, when he died, there were satellites in orbit. There was atomic energy making our electricity. there was television, and he was talking about atomic-powered elevators for his building. He was born 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Thank you.